Okay. So, good evening, everyone, and namaskar to all. So, today is 102nd birth anniversary of late Professor Baidyanath Misra. And Professor Baidyanath Misra was born on 22nd November 2000, sorry, 1920, and he breathed his last on 7th May 2019. After the Fani cyclone. And Professor Misra, in fact, okay, he's the founder secretary of Orissa Economics Association, and he nurtured the association uh, up to its 50 years age. So he was attending all the conferences, starting from the first to the Golden Jubilee Conference that happened at Navakrishna Chaudhary Center for Development Studies. And in his honor, this endowment lecture started in the year 2009, with the financial support of his son, Dr. Baidyanath Misra, who is a doctor at neurosurgeon at Hinduja Hospital. And today he's not able to join because he has duty. Actually, he told me he had left a message to me earlier that he may try to join, but then he may have duty today, so he may not be able to join with us. But we have with us his youngest son, Professor Sukant Misra. And so thank you, sir, for joining with us. So we all know that actually how Professor Baidyanath Misra nurtured this association to this level. He was the longest serving editor of the journal. In fact, he edited probably for 3 decades or so the journal. And he single-handedly actually has brought this association to this level. So, okay, so the first lecture was delivered by Professor Pulin B. Naik at Utkal University in 2009. And so this will be the 15th lecture in his honor. And the last lecture was delivered by, the 13th lecture was delivered by Professor Devashish Misra of Indian Statistical Institute, New Delhi. And this lecture is going to be delivered by Professor Tapas Sen, formerly professor at NIPFP. And you will get a long introduction of Professor Tapas Sen by the president. So with this brief note about Professor Baidyanath Misra, we again, on behalf of Orissa Economic Association, we pay tribute to him on his birthday. And with this, now I invite Professor Das, the president of Orissa Economics Association, to preside over the meeting and take it ahead. So over to you, sir, Professor.
Thank you very much. And with due regard to Professor Baidyanath Misra, kind of a one of the most towering personalities as a public person, as a great communicator, as a teacher, as an institution builder, as a policymaker, and a friend to both young and the elderly, and someone who wrote extensively, I think untiringly rather, all through his life. So I think he's a very major facility to communicate complex, let's say, socio-economic development processes to ordinary citizens. I think that's probably one of his very, very significant contributions. And so it's very nice to remember him today on his birthday. And before we sort of proceed with the lecture by, again, very, very distinguished Professor Tapas Sen, may I request Professor Sukant Misra, who is the youngest son and also an economist, to say a few words, please. Professor Sukant Misra.
Namaskar. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Again, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to celebrate my father's contributions to the economic of not only but of the country. And yes, it is today. Today is his birthday, the 102nd birthday. We are remembering him and talking about his contribution to the family in the century that he lived with us and taught us everything that we know today. I look forward to the presentation from Professor Tapas Sen. And also, again, thank you very much for celebrating my father today. And thank you to Professor Keshav Babu, Amarendra, thank you all very much. And to the Orissa Association, Economics Association. Okay, thank you.
It's very nice. We sort of heard you, and we also know that Professor Baidyanath Misra was a great family man that we know from several of our friends and colleagues who talk about him. So very nice you are with us. So with that, so we now turn to the main event of today. So the endowment lecture will be delivered by Professor Tapas Sen, a very, very distinguished personality. So he's known to be, I mean, many people actually know him for his major contribution to state finances. I mean, that's how sort of we know from several sources, but we also know that he is a great, he has been teaching in several sort of like institutions. He has been very, very closely associated with the policy making, both at the subnational as well as national levels. He had a long career as with the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy from 1981 to 2016, and during that time, and there was a very, very important period when he was so very much involved in several. In fact, I was seeing his profile, sort of is involved in a large number of public finance related sort of committees, and I think has contributed immensely to particularly to several state. I mean, he's of course very closely associated with Odisha Finance Commission. He has been an expert member for several other states like Sikkim, Meghalaya, Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, several sort of states, Uttarakhand, Uttar Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, Chhattisgarh. So he's one of the most sought after experts on the subjects, but also he has been uh, uh, he's basically from Odisha, though he's sort of more sort of based in Delhi for a long time. He did his graduation at Sambalpur, and then later his doctorate thesis on corporate taxation from Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics in Pune. He was associated with Price Waterhouse Coopers as a consultant, and then he was a visiting fellow at the State University of Maryland, at Shivaji University, at the London School of Economics, and he has been a consultant to several sort of intergovernmental bodies like World Bank, Asian Development Bank, UNDP.
I think there is some connectivity issues. Okay.
Is it clear now?
Now it is clear
Okay.
now. Yes.
Uh, so he also has prepared a lot of course materials. I think his range is something which really impressed me the most, because sort of like while he sort of has been sort of interacting with, let's say, very, very sort of high level policy spheres, he also has contributed a lot to the younger students, and he has sort of prepared course materials for them, taken special classes, sort of taught and trained officers in RBI and several other institutions. So he is a very, very special guest, a very, very special sort of scholar for us. And also Professor Baidyanath Misra's abiding interest in public finance makes it more relevant. So let's listen to Professor Tapas Sen, sir. So please, sir. Unmute kariye, sir.
Thank you for the generous introduction. I'm quite happy to be talking on this occasion particularly, and let me begin by paying my regards to Professor Baidyanath Misra. And I know for sure that taxation was one of the areas which was sort of was very close to Professor Baidyanath Mishra's heart. I have spoken to him about taxation in India. Um, he of course had a wide range, and he used to work on various areas of economics, and taxation was just one of them. But he himself admitted to me that taxation was something in which he wanted to work more, but he could not. Uh, Let me sort of begin by starting my presentation. Okay, now is the
This is perfect.
visibility?
Perfect. Yes, sir. Perfect.
Okay, thank you. All right, so now let's start on this talk. Now, what I'm going to do today, let me give you a flavor of what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about very few, a small number of issues in taxation, not the usual ones that we talk about in sort of talks of this kind, because I mean, we have heard a lot about uh, those issues. What I'm going to talk about today is slightly different. What are the sort of most important concerns in the international sphere? This is what I'm going to talk about, and I have chosen just three issues in taxation, which seem to be the most important issues in taxation at the moment, going by the limited evidence of what are the top priorities of the multilateral organizations. I cannot say that I have sort of trawled the taxation literature in recent years and have looked at all the journal articles, etc., to see what is the most important ones there. I'm completely going by what are the main issues that the multilateral organizations and bilateral organizations are focusing on and trying to promote, assuming that those are the policy issues which are of largest concern at the moment. Now, we of course know that the most basic purpose of taxation is raising revenues. Now, this itself has become a worldwide concern now. uh, I mean, this is evidenced by a tremendous emphasis on domestic resource mobilization in tax policies everywhere. I mean, this is domestic resource mobilization has become a very important issue. Uh, this is not only from the sort of multilateral organizations, bilateral organizations. It's also true for practically all governments at all levels. They're worried about resources, and tax revenues being the main contributor to the available resources, obviously, except in, of course, oil-rich countries. Um, most governments are concerned about resource mobilization and trying to gather as much revenue as possible from taxes. You can see this from the concerns of the tax administrations also. Many tax administrations across the world are suddenly concerned about, say, for example, unrealized tax potential, with or without changes in laws, statutory changes, or administrative changes. Whatever it takes, they want to raise more taxes. And this is why there is a renewed interest in what is called tax gap estimates now. Earlier it used to be called tax effort analysis. Now it is being called tax gap estimates. And I mean, one of the examples you can see, the HMRC of UK has been estimating annually the tax gaps for the last at least 4 or 5 years, maybe even more. Secondly, distributional issues in taxation are also regaining quite a bit of importance. At some point, we used to worry about equity, progressivity, things like that in taxation. But then subsequently, a point came when it was agreed that more than equity, it is the efficiency part which is more important as far as taxation is concerned. As long as taxation system of any country minimizes the welfare losses due to taxation, that would make it the most efficient, and that's good enough. Equity issues can be handled on the expenditure side. This was the broad fiscal policy gyan that was sort of freely available even 20, 25, 30 years ago. Now, suddenly there is a renewed interest in distributional issues, incidence on the poor, what is the extent of progressivity of taxation, etc., etc. So this is the second major concern that is there. One is, of course, the tax revenue itself, then the distribution issues, and third is the issue of how taxation as a component of fiscal policy can help in maintaining environmental sustainability. Now, this is understandable because, as we know, the question of environmental sustainability itself is becoming more and more urgent day by day. I mean, we are sort of hurtling to, the entire world is hurtling towards environmental disaster. And therefore, it is not very surprising that almost every possible tool that can help in maintaining environmental sustainability is being explored, and taxation being one possible tool is naturally, there are sort of people are exploring ways to use taxation for this purpose. Now, what has happened also is that partly these issues, and especially the issue about revenue raising, has become important in the aftermath of COVID-19 pandemic. The reason, of course, is easy to see, that COVID-19 pandemic caused recessionary tendencies. It gave rise to recessionary tendencies. A lot of business was lost. A lot of people lost their income. And definitely for a larger number of people, generally speaking, the income was negatively affected. And that obviously shrunk the tax revenue. And then what happened is that, because this is a sort of double whammy, because on the one side, the government lost revenue. On the other side, because there was a lot of increase in poverty, people were left in dire straits after the pandemic-induced economic losses. So the responsibility of the governments to look after their citizens increased tremendously, requiring higher amounts of government expenditure. Now, what has happened is that on one side, that revenues have come down. On the other side,
Good
the
night.
the
Okay, officer,
expenditure responsibilities have gone up. So obviously, this has created a pretty serious imbalance in terms of resources, and the governments are really desperate to increase the domestic resource mobilization as far as possible. Now, what has happened in recent times is that the inflation has also contributed to the problems. Because of widespread inflation, this is also causing quite a lot of misery among the poor, and they're increasing their dependence on the governments. And of course, the final nail was the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which has impacted the entire world economy, of course, to varying extents, but it has impacted negatively. So these are sort of current or immediate causes which have given rise to the imperatives that I just mentioned. Now, if you look at, I'm just as an example and closer home, I'm sorry. If we look closer home, we can see that uh, um, what is happening in India as far as tax revenue is concerned. Now, here I present in the graph just 4 years of gross tax revenue of the central government as a ratio of the GDP. And you can see that 2018-19, before the pandemic, it was 12.46%. Immediately at the beginning of the pandemic, it dropped to 10%. And it has not even increased by 1 percentage point uh, till end of the previous financial year. And it's unlikely that it will cross even this year the 11% mark. So that means that we are short by at least 1.5% of GDP with respect to the pre-pandemic levels of tax revenue. This is only as far as the union government is concerned. I do not have the data for the gross tax revenue of or total tax revenue of the center as well as the states together for recent years, because the data source itself, which was Indian Public Finance Statistics published by the Ministry of Finance, the latest number one can get is 2016-17 revised estimates, which I have mentioned in the note below, that this number was 11.18 for the central government in 2016-17, and for the center and states together it was 17.62. So if I were to guess, it would be in the vicinity of around 18.5% in 2018-19. And I mean, how far it has dropped, I don't know, because I haven't been able to make the calculations for both center and states together. So I just wanted to show the tendency of the dropping taxation by showing the central government's tax ratio. So you can see that the drop is quite substantial. 1.5% of the GDP is not a small number, and especially when we are talking about a situation where the GDP itself is also falling. So absolute number wise, the tax loss may be lesser, but the point is that at a time when the GDP itself is sort of depressed to some extent as compared to pre-COVID period, the low tax revenue is not allowing the government to undertake any major, what shall I say, pump priming activity to activate the economy in a big way. That is the crux of the problem, actually. Now, let me come to, with this introduction, let me come to the specific concerns that I wanted to talk about today. And let me emphasize that I'm not an expert on any of these issues, but as an interested person, I sort of keep in touch, and I keep trying to see what is happening as in my area, or my preferred area of research, which is sort of public finance. And in that course, I have found out that essentially there are three primary concerns that you can discern from the various publications that are coming out of these organizations which I have mentioned below. Um, these three issues are digitalization, um, BPS, and taxation of MNEs. I will explain these subsequently. And gender issues in taxation, that's the second one. The third one is tax policy and climate change. Now, the there are some amount of detail that I provide subsequently, but let me just sort of quickly mention what these are about. Digitalization is obviously use of IT, one, and second, uh, with the widespread availability of internet and all those things, the service sector's growth and provision of various services through the internet, that is the sort of context. And BEPS is stands for base erosion and profit sharing, and taxation of MNE stands for multinational enterprises. So these, the nexus between these three is that MNEs, are multinational enterprises, are minimizing their taxation in the current context. How they are doing it and why, I mean, how to tackle that is the issue that is being talked about. And there is a two-pillar solution which has been found out, or which has been proposed in basically last year only. Uh, and this solution actually uh, consists of two main things: division of profits by countries in a particular way, and a minimum tax rate on multinational enterprises, particularly multinational enterprises which are very large. So this is something we are going to talk about in some detail. Then the gender issues in taxation, and this is, I don't need to explain this. Basically, we are talking about whether taxation discriminates between sort of genders, and if it does so, how does it do it. And the context here is the uh, female work participation mainly. We know that India is one country where female work participation rate is notoriously low. Now, obviously, therefore, this issue relates to India very strongly. That can taxation do something, or is taxation in some way, or even in a limited way, responsible for uh, lower work participation of females? This is the question. There is a uh, consensus in the literature that taxation does have something to do with this, and therefore for gender development, or sort of removal of various kinds of gender biases, it is necessary to look at the gender biases in taxation also. So that is something I'm going to look at briefly. And the third one, again, which I'm going to look at briefly, is the tax policy and climate change. And the specific issue uh, which I'm going to talk about a little bit is the issue of carbon pricing, or since pricing depends on taxation, so you can say carbon taxation also. And specifically, I'm going to talk about exhaustible energy taxes, and the subsidies, which is just the sort of reverse of taxes. These are, as I mentioned, primarily issues of concern for the multilateral and bilateral organizations. Among the multilateral organizations are, the primary one is the OECD, but IMF, World Bank, and then regional organizations like the Asian Development Bank have also picked up these themes in a big way. Now let me come to the first one, the first issue, which is internationally grabbing a lot of attention. This is about base erosion and profit sharing, BEPS. Now, the basic idea here, as I mentioned, is that large multinational enterprises which are operating in several countries, they have some discretion, or they can manipulate their accounts uh, in such a way that they can, to some extent at least, determine where they want to show their profits, in which country they want to show their profits. And this they can achieve through various means like transfer pricing, etc. And why they do this, why would they sort of try to reallocate profits, is that the tax regimes in different countries are different. And there are, as we all know, tax havens uh, internationally. And therefore, it is of interest to these large multinational enterprises to reallocate profits in whichever way they can to the low tax regimes instead of the high tax regimes, and minimize their tax burden, which would of course increase their profitability. So that's the basic idea. And this has been facilitated by the digitalization of trade and services sector, and also by sort of discretionary valuation and payments for intangibles. Intangibles basically include things like brand name, goodwill, etc., etc. Now these have been quite facilitating factors, but not the responsible ones. And also, it is alleged that in the process of this reallocation by multinational enterprises of profits, it is often the poor and developing countries that lose their tax revenue. Because they are the ones who, in their desperation to garner resources, have fairly comparatively high tax rates on the corporate sector. And therefore, uh, it is of interest to the corporate sector to move their profits away from these countries to the low tax regimes. And therefore, I mean, the allegation is that it is the poor and developing countries which lose more than the sort of low tax regimes of developed nations. But that's not entirely true, in the sense that, take for example Europe, the effective tax rates in Europe, uh, average effective tax rates broadly are much, much higher than in India. I mean, you can see that by just looking at the tax GDP ratios. Tax GDP ratio in a country like Sweden is close to 40%, whereas in India, our aggregate tax revenue, tax to GDP ratio is just about, I mean, if you get 20%, that will be quite great. And in countries like Sri Lanka, it's even less at around 12 to 13%. So it's not entirely true that developing countries tax more, and therefore MNEs take their profits away from there and take it to low tax regimes. But the fact remains that the statutory tax rates in developing countries are generally not very low. They certainly are nowhere near as low as in the tax havens, which have sometimes even rates lower than 10%. Um, and also, what happens is that when this reallocation of profits happens, the amount of tax revenue lost by the source country from which profit is being moved away, and the amount of tax revenue gained by the low tax revenues which are favored by the MNEs. These two don't match. They are not commensurate. I mean, the tax revenue lost is much greater than the tax revenue gained by the destination countries. And therefore, if you take the aggregate resource mobilization of the world, this process actually reduces aggregate resource mobilization to a substantial extent, as estimated by the OECD. And hence the concern with this whole issue, and hence the sort of need for doing something about it. And OECD itself has drafted a two-pillar solution to tackle the problem. And these what are these two pillars? Basically, they comprise one, guidelines for international agreement on statutory allocation of large M&E profits. This is among the various countries of operation based on uh, not their accounts, what they show in their accounts, but on reasonable principles like actual revenues and sales, and many other, what is the extent of operation measured by various indicators. I will not go into the details, but if somebody is interested, they can go to the OECD website and look for this two-pillar solution, easily downloadable, no issues there. So that is the first part. And the second one is a minimum tax, which is currently proposed at 15% on allocated profits of MNEs. Now, that is the minimum tax, mind you. If a country already has a tax on corporate profits at more than 15%, they don't have to bring it down to 15%. But the idea of having a minimum tax of 15% is basically to reduce the tax rate differential between the tax havens, which have a currently tax rate below 10% even, and the average tax rate on corporate profits, say, which stands at around 22-23% in non-tax haven countries. Now you can see that the gap is massive, and I mean, it's no wonder that MNEs are trying to sort of play games here, and trying to take advantage of the tax rate differential between countries. Now, the idea is that if the tax havens are forced to raise their tax rate to 15%, this gap will fall. And once this gap falls, the attractiveness of the tax havens will be reduced, and then all these shenanigans by the multinational enterprises will also correspondingly come down. This is the broad idea. Now, these two are the key elements of the BPS IF. IF is inclusive framework. This has 132 members from both developed and developing countries. This is not final as yet. This is just a solution which has been proposed in some detail. As I mentioned, I am not a specialist in these, so I have not been able to understand all the details of these, but this is the gist of the solution. And now what has happened is that G20 has also taken up this agenda of two-pillar solution. And you must be aware that India is the new president of G20, and therefore India is also committed to carry this particular agenda forward. There is also the question that implementing the solution would require considerably greater amount of exchange of tax information between different countries, or at least one central warehouse of tax information and individual countries. Either way, I mean, because as I mentioned, that the two-pillar solution basically wants to allocate profits on the basis of some reasonable principles, and it cannot have data uh, which would be necessary to establish these reasonable principles unless there is exchange of information between all the countries. So therefore, a global forum on transparency and exchange of information for tax purposes, this was formed, and this is also again under the aegis of OECD, and currently it has 162 members, more than half of which are developing countries. So it will not be correct to say that it's only a rational a sort of proposal or an agenda of the developed countries. There are a lot of developing countries which have their interest in the same issues. All right, now what has happened, of course, I mean, as often happens in these matters, is that this two-pillar solution has already generated some controversy. Now, I just mentioned that this two-pillar solution was proposed only in last year, in 2021. Now, already the controversy has been generated because there was and this controversy was generated almost immediately afterwards. The two-pillar solution was proposed, but it was given a definite form by a letter from 4 UN experts on human rights, uh, which expressed concern that the solution may violate Article 2 of International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And their objections were procedural as well as on the content. Now, what was the procedural problem? The alleged procedural problem was that these UN experts alleged, or they said that they have reason to believe that the representation of poor and developing countries in the formulation was inadequate. Uh, it reflected the views of the developed countries more than that of the developing countries. That was one, as far as the procedural problem was concerned. And what was the problem as far as the content is concerned? the the alleged problem with the content is that even if this was done, it was not going to help the developing or poor countries. In fact, it was going to make their position worse, and it would only be the developed countries, the high tax developed countries like the European nations, which will actually benefit from this two-pillar solution. These, again, I mean, I'm sort of compressing this to two major points, but broadly, this is what their objections were. And incidentally, many of these concerns were originally raised by other organizations, like what is called the South Center, with 54 developing countries and members. There was a State of Tax Justice report, which also raised some issues about the two-pillar solution. These are all in recent times. And also a report by the Right to Education group. These are all easily available on the net. If somebody is interested, you can have a look. OECD has replied to the letter of the UN experts, It has rebutted the procedural objection. It has said that as far as this two-pillar solution is concerned, this was accepted by all the members of BEPS inclusive framework, which, as I mentioned, has more than 150 member countries, more than half of which are developing countries, and therefore it is not correct to say that the developing countries are not adequately represented. And as far as the objections to the content, uh, that is the proposed changes in laws, etc., are concerned, uh, OECD does not reply to that point, but it simply points out that if there are issues in these areas, these are better discussed and addressed by the inclusive BEPS inclusive framework, where developing countries are there and they can sort of bat it out among themselves and come out with a appropriate measure. So that is where the situation rests now. Nothing is final as yet, but there is a very detailed and my impression is that it's also very complicated sort of proposal, this two-pillar solution by the OECD, because while they say two-pillar, actually once you start digging into it, you find that each of the pillars has numerous issues that need to be sorted out before you can really do some concrete change in the sort of statutory taxation systems. Okay, so that much about this BEPS issue. Let me again reiterate that I'm not going into details, because my purpose of talking about these three things only is just to get across a flavor of uh, what is today's menu, sort of. What are the things that are being talked about in the international taxation area? And then if somebody is interested, if I'm able to generate some interest in researchers who are hearing this talk, you can easily get the details, because most of these multilateral organizations and bilateral organizations, they make available their output, their papers, reports, etc., on the internet, so easily downloadable, most of these things. So you can get the details and go into as much detail as you want. Okay, now as far as taxation in gender is concerned, this is one area where there is no concrete plan of action yet. The issues are being talked about, issues are being flagged, problems are being shown up. There are some country studies which are being done, but a general plan of action with respect to what ought to be done in and how taxation should be gender neutral, really gender neutral, not just gender blind. Let me sort of emphasize that gender blind is not necessarily gender neutral. I will sort of explain that in a moment. But basically, let me sort of venture this statement that the most important and basic statement of the issues is contained in a paper by Janet Stotsky. And this is not something new. This paper was actually, it came out in 1996, but it has been picked up by a lot of other people, including multilateral and several bilateral organizations, which include World Bank, IMF, OECD, ADB, FCDO of UK. Lots of organizations have taken these up. And there are different frameworks which are used to talk about the link between taxation and gender, but the most helpful is probably the one which was provided in the original article by Stotsky, and this is to differentiate between explicit and implicit discrimination. Now, explicit one is characterized by tax systems that directly differentiate tax treatments based on gender and as an explicit criterion. Now, what that means, I will come to it shortly. And also, the implicit ones are where those are those that do not sort of discriminate explicitly, but which interact with societal or economic differences between men and women in such a way that the tax system has a differing impact on men and women respectively. Now, as examples of these two, let me sort of give very obvious examples that the, the sort of explicit discrimination, let's say, comes when say women as in some countries are required by law, by income tax law, personal income tax law, to club their income with their husband's income. Now, what that does, mind you, is that with a progressive system of taxation, as most income tax, personal income tax systems are, what happens is that uh, suppose the husband, consider two situations, that it is the main income earner is the husband, and let's say they have X amount of income from that husband's income. Now, X amount of income would have a relatively medium level tax rate, let's say around 20%. Now, when the wife also starts working, and if the law requires that her income must be added to the husband's income for tax purposes, then that X becomes X plus the new amount of income, which let us say is Y. So X plus Y. And in a progressive system, that X plus Y may get into a higher tax bracket, like say from 20 to 25%. Now, what that means is that the wife's income as the marginal income is being taxed at a higher rate, higher marginal rate. And that is where the discrimination comes in. So this is the example of an explicit discrimination. Now, implicit discrimination is not so obvious. I would give a simple, try to give a simple example, which may be realistic or not, that's a different issue. But just to sort of give you the idea, think about indirect taxes, let's say our GST, and think about items which are just used only by women. I'm sure you can think of a number of such commodities. And if the tax system systematically taxes those commodities, it does not directly differentiate between men and women, but the tax rate on commodities used mostly or primarily or exclusively by women, if they are systematically taxed at higher rates than the other commodities, then you can see that there is a differing impact. The tax system has a differing impact on men and women, and there is implicit discrimination. There are other examples of implicit discrimination that can be given, but I think you get the idea. Okay. Now, basically, as I mentioned, that the context of the gender bias in economic matters, basically, we are worried about these gender biases mainly because of low rates of female work participation and also gender-based wage differentials. These are clear examples of, and I don't know, consequences of gender bias in the economic system, entire economic system, and taxation is a part of that economic system. Now, these I have already explained that what is the explicit bias and the implicit bias. Let me now go forward. And context and the nature of gender bias in taxation, basically, we are talking about there are some not so obvious connections. For example, the progressivity of the overall tax mix can reduce the tax burden on the lowest paid, benefiting women. Now, why so? Mainly because if you take a distribution, gender distribution of the wage payments, then what you find is that most of the women across the world, if you take, are at the lower levels of wage payments. And men are dominate the higher levels of income and wage, etc., etc. So if the tax system is highly progressive, then it does benefit the women, because the women are taxed less, the because they are mostly at the lower levels of incomes and wages, and it taxes men more heavily. But instead, if the tax system is regressive, uh, or let's say very low levels of taxes on capital income or on capital, or high levels of tax on consumption, these kinds of taxes have been shown empirically to have the opposite impact. So broad regressivity of the tax system uh, can actually penalize women and further discourage them from earning their income and getting into the formal sector to earn their proper wages. So these are issues which are not very uh, easily understood, or these are not sort of immediately apparent to most people. Um, Even tax administration and compliance aspects can have different outcomes for the two sexes. For example, I mean, just one example I would like to give. Now, we have seen an increasing use of IT in the interaction with tax authorities by taxpayers. You and I mean, we are using a lot more IT these days than what we used to do even 15 years ago. Now, this actually can have different implications for men and women. Why? Because the relative access of men and women to IT-based or internet-based appliances, and the access itself is relatively is different, and for women the access is not as much there as men. Therefore, when you start uh, using more and more IT, more and more of internet in the interactions, then for those women who are not having access, and as I mentioned, you can, I mean, the data show that women have much less access to these, and therefore automatically their sort of ability to uh, comply with the tax authorities, interact with the tax authorities, is comparatively limited. So that is one this thing. But on the other hand, I mean, things have pros and cons. So this also has a pro, which is that women are also uh, less willing to uh, interact with tax authorities physically. That, I mean, in our country that is true, and much more true in developing countries of Africa and several other places. So that is because of various reasons, including being bullied and by the male members of tax authorities and so on and so forth. So there is a sort of unwillingness of women to actually make physically sort of interact with the tax authorities, and therefore greater use of IT and internet without requiring them to actually go to offices of tax authorities is a boon for them. But it is a boon provided they have access to the necessary tools. That is the kind of conclusion that emerges. It's a conditional boon, sort of. One of the reasons why there hasn't been a lot of concrete proposals in this area is a lack of empirical research of what is this. This is basically a distributive issue. And in the norm, say for example, when we do tax incidence analysis, we look at uh, either different types of economic groups like uh, owners of capital, labor, and so on and so forth, or we look at income groups or expenditure groups and look at what part of the tax burden is borne by which group. Now here also we are doing the same thing. We are trying to find out the tax incidence by gender. So instead of income groups, instead of economic categories, we are basically looking at gender differentiate, gender based tax incidence. Unfortunately, there is very little tax data available which is gender differentiated. It's not that in this day and age these basic information are not available. They are available with the governments, but they are not made available in a gender differentiated form for research purposes. So obviously what that means is that uh, one needs to put pressure on the government to provide this data in the way researchers require. Now, the record of governments in terms of making data available are very mixed. There are cases where more and more data are being made available, and then there are cases where more and more data are being hidden. They are not being, I mean, in 10-15 years ago, without computers, the kind of data we could get now, although everything is there on the central computers, these numbers are not provided to openly to general public. So it's the basic availability is not the issue. The issue is the willingness of the governments to part with the data. That's in the form that the researchers would require. Anyway, an early attempt uh, to do an empirical research of this kind, tax incidence by gender, was carried out in Ethiopia. This is a working paper by the World Bank. I have given the this in the presentation. I have given the reference. You can have a look if you want. Now, having said all this, I should also mention, just in case this part is overlooked, is that while everybody is calling for gender neutrality in taxation, real gender neutrality, not just gender blindness. For example, as I mentioned, gender blind means you don't particularly, while forming writing your statutes, you don't have gender in mind. You are writing the statutes for everyone. It applies to everybody in the same way. But when it comes to implicit kind of gender discrimination, gender blind, being gender blind is not necessarily being gender neutral. So there is a call for genuine gender neutrality, but it does not include deliberate positive discrimination. So obviously, since the current situation in most countries or many countries is that uh, various kinds of gender differentials persist in the economic sphere. So therefore, there is a case for deliberate discrimination or positive discrimination in favor of women, and therefore that is not something this particular issue is looking to neutralize. Okay, so that's as far as the gender issue and taxation is concerned. Now let me come to the third issue. Again, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but again, just introduce and outline the issue and leave it to the listeners as to whether it interests them enough to go into more details on their own. Um, the idea of pricing pollution or environmental damage is nothing new. I mean, there have been papers, articles on in economics on these things right from the 1970s or even earlier maybe. And there is a significant literature on how best to price pollution. Now, various tools have been examined: taxation, subsidies, trading permits for pollution, outright controls. I mean, different kinds of tools are available and are used actually by different governments in the policy mix. So, discussion of these is not something new. What is new is that in the post-COVID scenario, there is a massive need for resources in most countries. And what is being proposed now is that carbon taxes can be a dual purpose tool. It can reduce carbon linked climate damage, and it can generate additional domestic resources for welfare activities. So that is new. Earlier, it was just talked about as uh, an environmental concern, issue of environmental concern. Now, what it is being posited as is that it is both a revenue raising tool and carbon tax. Basically, I'm talking about carbon taxes. Uh, they can be revenue raising tool, and they can be used for reducing carbon linked to climate damage. So it's a dual purpose tool. That is what is being talked about now, and that is something which is different from earlier. Now, how does this happen? Tweaking relative taxation or subsidization. Again, I'm clubbing subsidies with taxes because subsidies are basically the reverse of taxes. Now, relative taxation or subsidization of various energy sources can actually help calibrate uh, the use of those different energy sources. Obviously, simply through profit motive and general reaction to basic price theory that higher prices would reduce demand. So that basic link is to be used when you tax the particular energy sources you don't really like or you don't really want to be used more, tax them heavily. Those which you want to promote, you tax them less or even subsidize. So it's clean energy versus dirty energy. That's exactly the kind of thing that can be calibrated through relative taxation. It has another benefit which has been pointed out by OECD. Now, carbon taxes are comparatively difficult to evade, mainly because the sources of energy are limited and easy to monitor and control. So it's not very easy to evade carbon taxes if the governments decide to tax these fossil fuels and electricity and things like that, because all these are from the organized sector. You can't get it from the informal sector, and if you can't get it from the informal sector, it even the informal sector, when it has to buy these or obtain these energy sources from the formal sector, and therefore has to pay these taxes, carbon taxes. And furthermore, if such taxes are properly designed, the administration of these taxes is done properly, it can help in shrinking the informal sector, because nobody can operate without energy. And when energy is required, then you have to go to this formal sector. And if you have a tax which requires you to come into the formal sector in some way, or at least in a limited way, even the people in the informal sector would tend to gradually enter the formal sector simply to obtain the energy that they require. Um, so that's broadly the role that taxes can play in terms of environmental concerns. We all know, this is common sense, that I mean, if you tax fossil fuels heavily, and let's say even within electricity, let's say you tax the uh, electricity generated by thermal uh, stations more heavily than those generated by the uh, hydroelectric sector projects. It possibly, I'm not sure about that, but possibly that would be a step in the right direction. To what extent this can actually be done, and whether such a tax system can be sustained, is something that needs, what shall I say, detailed analysis in the particular context. The contexts are not the same across the world, and therefore one needs studies in particular contexts. Now, as a matter of interest, I just wanted to mention that India's carbon pricing score, which includes taxation, based on the OECD benchmark of 60 euros per ton of CO2, was 13.3%, which means that India actually taxes a ton of CO2 at 13.3% of Euro 60, which will be, I don't know, maybe around 10 euros or less than 10 euros. Now, but that is compared to 9.3% of China. So India is actually taxing CO2 at a greater rate than China, Russia, which is 7.5%, Brazil, which is almost inexistent at 1.3%, but it is very low compared to the highest score of 69.7% of Switzerland. In 2018, these computations were made by OECD, just to show where different countries are in terms of carbon pricing or carbon taxation. So basically to show what is the amount of ground that remains to be covered by different countries. So that's basically the sort of broadly the issue of taxation and environmental concerns. Again, as I mentioned, the idea is just to introduce this topic, and then if one is interested, one can I have again given the starting reference for anybody who is interested. They can take it from there and go into further details. Sorry. Now, I just want, before concluding, I just want to, or before ending, I just want to make one observation. And this is something which I sort of, it's my own reaction to all these three issues and what is being talked about these days, how to do things, etc., etc., in terms of tax reform, etc. Now, it is quite interesting for me to note that uh, during the decades when I was doing most of my tax research, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, the international consensus, basically they used to call it the Washington Consensus, was to make the tax system as efficient as possible. Efficiency was the main thing. I mean, Richard Musgrave's classic uh, talk of what are the main tasks of public finance, he mentioned three: that resource allocation, distribution, and stabilization. Now, resource allocation basically is about efficiency, so that you maximize output. Now, that one was emphasized continuously by the Washington Consensus. And all the time people were talking about um, to minimize welfare losses, you do not burden the tax system with all sorts of objectives. You only use tax system basically for raising revenues with least amount of uh, welfare loss. As you know, every tax except for something like a poll tax has a welfare cost. There is a certain amount of welfare loss. Uh, Textbooks will tell you that there is that triangle, Harburger's triangle, which represents the welfare loss. And that welfare loss was to be minimized. That was the main task, according to the Washington consensus those days. And therefore, there was this KISS principle, keep it simple, and reduce special incentives, allowances, reduce rate differentials, if possible, levy at one rate. Even today, there are a lot of public finance specialists who keep talking about single rate VAT or single rate GST. Now, these were the accepted kind of principles. Now, the current thoughts, as represented by these three special issues that I mentioned, seem to be going back to special considerations in the tax policy framework. And what that would mean is that you are you again introduce a lot of exemptions, special rates, um, special incentives, differentiating tax rates, etc., etc., which means that again you are talking about complicating the tax system. And that is something which I think sort of in principle goes against what was propagated for 3 decades by the same sort of multilateral and bilateral agencies. Maybe they have had a change of heart. Maybe they don't realize that they are actually weakening their own stance or own earlier stance. I don't know what it is, but to me, it's certainly a sort of uh, move going backwards in terms of simplifying the tax system. I'll stop there and let me try and get out of the presentation mode. Now, okay. Right. So thank you very much. And I have not been interrupted even once. So that sort of means either one thing, that everybody is asleep, or people are sort of giving me their rapt attention. One of the two things. I would prefer it to be the second one, but let me end there, and uh, let's have any discussion if you like.
Thank you so very much. It was absolutely rich fare. So no doubt about that, and very interesting, at least at a very personal level, I think. The fact that you did not quite use a lot of data issue, which one would have expected. So if you thought people might have slept off, not being interested, but I think the way you presented and sort of brought in this really three new areas of sort of research for all of us, and because it's also being recorded, so this will be available for other scholars as well. So very, very interesting sort of insights. And I think also that sort of reflects your long-standing and so very intensive research that you have done. So whether it is relating to taxation of the MNEs, your so bringing in this very fine issues, sort of so far as the gender and taxation is concerned, and also you were sort of dot there when it mentioned about the climate change or the environmental concerns and taxation. I think they are the one small thing I understand is that maybe these also require a lot of maybe micro level detailed sort of empirical inquiries, and that would be also adding to more complexities as you sort of were worried about. But then, so very, very interesting presentation. So some questions, discussions from the floor, please. Yeah. So anyone wants to ask, please go ahead.
Or comment, because I have made it very clear that I am no expert on these issues. So there is no guarantee that I will be able to answer questions, but I would certainly like to hear comments.
Yeah, please, please.
Sorry, can I?
Srijit,
No, actually, no. I am also not an expert in these areas, but I'm not going to comment either on your presentation also. But one thing on tax, which has been bothering, and I raised it at umpteen places, and I thought I'll raise it with you because here I think your expertise will be much more relevant, given that you have worked on state finances. So India is one of the countries where uh, direct taxes largely is a central as per the central list, and states do not have much of a role there. But given the initial motivation that you began with, no, that particularly given the pandemic, given everything, states finances are going down. So do you think it would be appropriate and this would also be relevant, perhaps the way you also concluded, whether efficiency concerns or other concerns that you brought about, should states also not be having a pie and having a say in what should be a contribution or how direct taxes can also come to their kitty? So like in the US and many other countries it is there. So because once we talk about progressive or regressive, and increasingly in India we are, the states are also, and also the center is relying on indirect taxes, which is not a very not a progressive tax looking way of looking at things. So I don't know, Baman, how effective this is, but yeah, this is just my thought, and I would want you to reflect on this.
Keshav, can I respond to that?
yes, please.
Okay. Now, your question actually had uh, different angles to it with respect to taxation. But let me give you my reaction. After all these days of research on taxation, what I realize is that uh, in a country like India, the government simply cannot afford to rely heavily on direct taxes only. And the reason is pretty simple. A large chunk of economic activity in India is still in the informal sector, which is completely cash based and so on. Now, if you relied too heavily on direct taxes, which by definition will either depend on voluntary disclosure or the link with the formal sector only. You cannot really go into the informal sector to have sort of enforce your direct taxes. In such a situation, if the government heavily relied on direct taxes, its tax revenues are bound to shrink. The only way it can actually have a very large tax base and widespread tax base, including the informal sector, is to have a pretty heavy presence of indirect taxes. And the moment you have a heavy presence of indirect taxes, whose incidence you can't really control, so invariably what happens at the end of it is that you get into a pretty regressive system. So while I haven't personally undertaken an incidence analysis, my logic tells me that the tax system in India, because of the peculiar circumstances that we are in, is likely to have caused a regressive distribution of the overall tax revenue, direct, indirect, all taxes pulled together, and state, center, everything put together. Now, as far as the center state issue is concerned, after the introduction of GST, really speaking, all the initiatives must rest with the center, because what is the amount of discretion that is there with the states as far as the laws and rules are concerned? Out of the total tax revenue of the country, the states are in control of a very small part, maybe around 20% of the total tax revenue. The rest of it, the laws relating to the 80% of tax revenues, is basically at the central level. So any kind of statutory change or legal reform or administrative reform, for that matter, has to be initiated at the central level. The states really can only play the role of a follower, not the leader.
Yeah. Anyone else? Professor Pradhan, you want to? HK Pradhan, sir.
This is nice listening to Professor Tapas Sen. I think
I'm sorry,
ଟିକେ
Professor Pradhan, you're
ଭଲ୍ୟୁମ୍
not
ଟା ଟିକେ
audible.
ବଢାନ୍ତୁ, ଶୁଭୁନି ଭଲ.
a nice listening to you, Professor Sen.
Thank you.
And I think I met you quite a while ago. That no travel to Delhi. I think you are located a little away, I suppose. So recently I have not, but it's really indeed nice and very lovely lectures. A lot of thoughts, and I was very carefully listening to your carbon in emerging area of taxation. And I think, unfortunately, the GST framework, has not embedded the carbon related taxes or the tax on greenhouse emission. So I think this is something which would come up, and this has to be by the center, as you rightly said. It is a national framework which should take into account. And but the way the companies have gone in many ways, and I think we need to also recognize that there are companies who are also decarbonizing, or they are doing. There is a lot of work happening all of a sudden. I do not know whether it is reality or it is simply greenwashing, but at least companies have tried to offset carbon out of atmosphere by either creating a green forest or bringing some form of carbon removal system, or even alternative forms of investing in green energy, renewable energy, or things like that. So in a taxation framework, this net impact is very important to assess. So we really need a framework to assess the net cost to the society or to the environment by these companies. And unfortunately, even the auditing and other practices have not evolved to capture this value, the net impact.
Yes.
So even though the slogans are net zero and all our commitments internationally, but I think domestically we have not evolved into a framework to put into a number. So what is your, I mean, and I really appreciate your touching that point. What's your view on that?
Okay, let me sort of extend my neck into the sort of loop and say that these multinational organizations, I mean, this is a very sweeping statement I'm making, but this is what I have found generally, is that they're excellent at paying lip service, but doing nothing. They will announce to the world and all and sundry that we are doing this, we are doing that. They will coin extremely catchy terms, make big show of it, but de facto, when it comes to really doing something, some change in behavior, the only thing that they will change is only when it makes profits for them. So basically, if you want corporates to change their behavior, you have to hit them where it hurts, which is their profitability. And that you can do only by taxing the bad things, so to say, more heavily. Now, what happens in India, to talk about what is the actual situation in India, when GST was introduced, the petroleum and petroleum products were kept out of the purview of GST, and they are still within the competence of the states. But mind you, that even before GST was introduced, and probably even today, there were states where 70% of the total VAT revenue was from petroleum products. 70%, as much as 70%. And in other states, if you took altogether an average kind of thing, then commodity wise tax revenues showed that not less than 50% of the tax revenues of all states put together were from petroleum goods. So states have been taxing petroleum goods quite heavily, petroleum and petroleum products quite heavily. And then the central government itself also has a lot of taxation, right from the sort of royalties and cesses, and those are outside the normal taxation of GST or whatever. I mean, they have pretty heavy cesses and so on and so forth. It's only in recent times that the royalties have been reduced to compete with foreign markets. Although I don't really understand what is the need to compete with foreign entities in this particular sphere. I would like India to lose the competition, really, because then that would mean that we would consume less of the fossil fuels. We don't want more consumption of the fossil fuels. So why compete about that? But in any case, the point I'm trying to make is that India does tax fossil fuels quite heavily. And the question is, does it commensurately encourage the cleaner energy? And does it make the cleaner energy, that is even more important, does it make cleaner energy available for the users? If I'm a corporate and I'm quite conscious that my consumption of petroleum and its products is actually hurting me quite a lot, I'm paying a lot of taxes on these, and if I could substitute that by some other form of energy, say wind or whatever, which is subsidized, then if I did that, it would actually improve my profitability considerably. I would immediately jump for it. But that doesn't happen for the simple reason that the alternatives are not made available. They are still not at that stage where we have, or they're not still available at the scale that is required. So therefore, the problem, as far as I can see, is not that there is a problem with taxation in India. The problem is that we do not have adequate availability of the cleaner energy sources. And that is where governmental action needs to be concentrated.
Any other Professor Manoj Babu, upon?
Okay, no, just to take this last point, I think we are moving in a direction where more and more energy is being obtained from non-renewable sources. From the renewable sources. And the way the current structure is there, it will take a long time to reduce our dependence on coal. That is for certain that it will take quite long time. We might be able to, but even then, the movement that is there for some of the renewable energy, that is actually much more than what one was expecting, say, 15 years ago. That is one thing. But the other point I will say is, to reduce carbon or to be environmental friendly, it is not only just the source of energy, but the use of energy. For example, how many of us know that, for example, building is one of the most energy intensive sectors. Why? Because it uses all energy intensive materials, steel, aluminum, and bricks, and so on. So building as such, direct use of energy in building construction might not be so much, but the embedded energy in building construction is very heavy. And one might think of whether, one can use taxation policy to go for some kind of clean energy there. Again, one is not certain because, as Professor Sen says, ultimately it depends on how much is available at the aggregate level. If clean energy is not sufficiently available, then possibly our options will be limited. But still, we can prioritize to those sectors where we are using energy heavily. That will possibly reduce it to some extent overall energy use. I think the other thing, I wanted to ask one clarificatory type questions that our MNCs, how much of our corporate taxes is from the MNCs? Are there some data available on the first point that Tapas was telling?
I have not collected any data on this, but obviously, I mean, these are issues of principle, and OECD across the world has made calculations and has sort of found out that the aggregate tax loss because of this BEPS activity by MNEs is very substantial. It comes out to be something like $900 billion or something like that across the world.
That's quite interesting. But would it be only from the profit, or it could also be by showing, for example, some of the employees, when you are having work from home, you might show some of your employees in tax havens. Would that also be a possibility?
No, see, why would they do it? The employees themselves, for personal tax purposes, may be doing it, but a company would do it only for profitability's sake. Basically, the only thing, I mean, this is the sort of driving principle of the corporate sector, that profits, they want more profits. Whatever they do, they want more profits.
Anyway, thank you for covering so many issues. Particularly the gender issue was very new to me.
Amarendra, you being a public finance person, so
No, my concern was on like the progressive tax in India, and so recently we abolished the wealth tax, and I don't really understand that logic because in other countries, and particularly in World Economic Forums during COVID-19, there was a discussion that the rich people argued that who stops the countries imposing us a lot of tax on us and using this tax for paying the COVID vaccines bill. But in India, we don't have inheritance tax, we don't have wealth tax, and like Professor Manoj Panda was asking, we don't know actually how much tax we are collecting from the MNCs because they all operate in special economic zones, and we give all tax exemptions. But on the other hand, now we are when you look at the indirect taxes, and it is contributing quite a huge amount. And on indirect taxes, we are imposing all these regulatory taxes like environmental tax. Like I would like to hear from Professor Sen about his opinion on this. Whether it is really logical to abolish the wealth tax, and what is your thought on the inheritance taxes like we have in other countries? Yeah, that's all. Although on environmental things, like I have other concerns, but I think it will be too late. We are already 8:50. So, yeah.
Okay. My answer is quite simple. Conceptually and theoretically, capital taxation is necessary. It complements income taxation, and it is important for the purpose of direct tax progressivity. So on that, there is no dispute. But why were they abolished? The argument was a typical administrator's argument. The argument was that these taxes, we spend more on collecting these taxes than we get revenue. So the cost of collection is higher than the actual collection of taxes from these taxes. That is why we don't think it is worth the while. Now, if my point, I have a rejoinder to that argument also. Think about land revenue. And even land revenue today, let's forget about it. But even say 25 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, what was the collection of land revenue? And what was the cost of collection of land revenue? In fact, the cost of collection of land revenue was probably 200 times that of the actual collection of land revenue. And still we had land revenue. It continues to date. And the reason simply is that the purpose of land revenue is not only to collect taxes. It is also to maintain land records and several other sort of, it has very important purposes, social purposes. And that is why the land revenue system is important. The sort of revenue raised from land revenue is totally unimportant that way. It's the records which are the most important part of land revenue system. Similarly, as I mentioned, for the completeness of the progressive tax structure of the direct taxes, these smaller taxes were important. So the administrator's argument that we spend more money in collecting them than in actual collection, first of all, you may be totally inefficient. You may not be efficiently collecting the tax. That is why you are getting less revenue. So to sort of, in that case, what the argument becomes, it becomes that because I am not good at collecting this tax, therefore let us give up this tax. Now then the argument becomes even worse. So my feeling is that that kind of argument, it can lead to nowhere. It can lead to very wrong places. If we think that a particular system in its totality is important, every element of that totality is important. We can't just selectively take away some things and say that these are not worth it, and only some major things are worth it. And measuring everything by only the revenue that it collects may be incorrect. There may be complementarities, and those complementarities may also be kept in mind in collecting these taxes. They themselves may not give you much revenue, but they may close loopholes which will raise your income tax revenue. Even that is possible. There are plenty of examples like this in economic literature. So broadly speaking, I do not agree with this system of leaving out these minor taxes, because I feel that they are a part of a whole which cannot be just sort of selectively thrown out.
I think Professor Mitali Chinara has posted a question. She wants an example to differentiate between gender blind and gender neutral. That is, I think you already gave some examples.
I have already talked about that during this thing. But
Yeah.
once again, if you want an example, let me put it this way: that let's say you have a tax system with only one rate for everything, and that one rate applies to all sorts of things. But let us say that women consume that category of commodity much more than men. So in that case, even though the statute doesn't say anything about separate rates for women or men, uh, in that sense it is gender blind. But it is not gender neutral, because the circumstances are that women consume more of that particular commodity, and therefore or that class of commodity, and therefore they pay more taxes than men, that particular tax. So the tax is not gender neutral in the real sense. So that is the difference between being gender blind and gender neutral.
Thank you so very much. I think maybe if there are more questions, maybe one can communicate with Professor Sen. He has been speaking for a long time and is very a nice way of even communicating that I like very much. And before I sort of request Amarendra to give a word of thanks, I suddenly reminded of a very personal sort of incident. Like several times in Delhi, I often stayed in the NIPAP guest house, and very often I have seen late into the night, I'm not late beyond midnight, it's Professor Tapas Sen's office room lit, and he would be working. So that really amazed me. That he's a very, very hardworking person, and that is also reflected in the very interesting lecture that he has given. So thank you so much, sir, for your kindly accepting our request and being with us. So with that, Amarendra, if you please.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. In fact, I was thinking while listening this public finance lecture that many of us have studied the public finance book written by Professor Baidyanath Misra. That was a very popular book in Orissa for public finance. That was a small book, and particularly this theory of tax incidence and burden and shifting, all these things. So at undergraduate level, we used to read that book. I think that book would be still available in many libraries of Orissa.
Yes.
So this is a proper tribute to Professor Baidyanath Misra on his 102nd birthday. So thank you so much, sir, for bringing out the diverse issues of public finance, and particularly the taxes and the difficulties or the conflict between the equity object and efficiency, or say nowadays we are talking about the regulatory objectives and revenue raising objectives of taxation. And I'm sure, in fact, many of the college lecturers have joined with us. That would help them in teaching to their students. And so this, I think, we may close. And again, thank you so much, Professor Sukant Misra, for joining with us in early morning from America. And thank you so much, all senior members of Orissa Economics Association, for joining with us. Thank you so much, President, for presiding over this meeting. Thank you so much. With this, we may close. And good night to all. Good night.
Thank you, sir.
Well, it was very nice, actually. It's very, very, very unusual lecture, in fact. Yeah. So, Amarendra.
Yes, I'm trying to close the first. Let me stop the recording.